him, Daniel Shays saw poor farmers like himself, many of whom he had served with in the Revolutionary War, now being sent to rot in debtors' prisons. Families were left without providers, and mothers were forced to beg in the streets. Shays began to meet frequently with his supporters at Conky's Tavern, inciting them with talk of self-government and rebellion. Shays had convinced his fellow farmers that something had to change. During the summer of 1786, all over western Massachusetts, conventions were held to determine a list of demands that were to be delivered to state government leaders in Boston. Because Boston was both the center of industry and also the major port, the state government was largely composed of wealthy lawyers, merchants, and property owners. In the Eastern establishment, Samuel Adams had vowed to stay out of politics after the Revolution, but the temptation was too much, and he eventually ran for state senate. He won, and was soon elected Senate President. One of his first acts was to call for an end to the county conventions.
County conventions are not only useless, but dangerous. They served an excellent purpose and were highly necessary when they... It can never be the duty of one man to be concerned in more than one revolution.
But Daniel Shays and the farmers of western Massachusetts didn't agree. They were indeed concerning themselves with a second rebellion. They had tried the way of conventions, petitions, and letters to their elected leaders. They had tried to seek justice legally, and they had been ignored. Shays still had no way to pay his debts to the businessmen of eastern Massachusetts, and was faced with the threat of imprisonment, crushing poverty, and the loss of his farm. To feed his family, he had been forced to sell his most cherished belonging, the sword he had received from the Marquis de Lafayette. Fortunately, Daniel Shays still had one sword left, the cutlass he had carried in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And now he sharpened it again in preparation for a new battle. In the late fall of 1786, Daniel Shays began to muster and train an army. Among them were many of the men he had fought with in the Revolution. By 1786, post-Revolutionary War America was on the verge of economic collapse. Everywhere, businesses were closing, and debt was running rampant. Most were unable to pay their debts, and were thrown into prison where they suffered in horrible conditions. The state governments were teetering on the verge of bankruptcy, and had instituted a policy of heavy taxation. The federal government was helpless to solve these problems, because it had been given no political power. In western Massachusetts, Daniel Shays and his followers had been speaking out against the state government's policies, but their entreaties had fallen on deaf ears. They decided they had to take action. On September 29th, 1786, a boiling point was reached. As the court prepared to convene, 1,000 men came out of the wilderness on a hill above Springfield, Massachusetts. Shays now unsheathed his sword and ordered the fife and drum players to strike up a tune. The men began marching in cadence, sprigs of hemlock swaying on their heads as they held their weapons.
An authority.
Jonathan Judd, one of the 900 government militiamen who stood inside the court building, recorded the events.
A sorrowful day. Brother against brother, father against son, militia at the courthouse, and mob above the ferry. The mob threatened the lives of all who opposed them.
The insurgents...
Calling upon his experience in the Revolutionary War, Shays had his men make a show of loading their muskets. As soon as the weapons were loaded, Shays charged with his men in a fury toward the courthouse. Their mission was to shut down the courts by any means necessary.